All right, so just very quickly, we're going to go over the appendix to Chapter 4 here, Appendix B. Um, this appendix covers concepts called consumer surplus, producer surplus, and gains from trade within a price system. So um, we've already talked about something called surplus, where quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. We have to be careful because that is completely different from these concepts of consumer and producer surplus, which are basically the gains to consumers and producers, respectively. Okay, so be careful about that. They are not the same thing. But let's talk about consumer surplus first. So this is basically the gains to consumers, right? When they purchase something, it's the difference between what a consumer would be willing to pay for an item and what they actually pay. Okay, so just for sake of example, suppose that you were willing to pay $5 for an energy drink, but you only had to pay $2, right? And you had the $5 bill ready to pay for that energy drink, the $5 that you were willing to pay, right? So you have $5, you buy the energy drink, it only costs you $2, right? And so you pay with the $5 bill and you get $3 back in change. And then what you have at that point is an energy drink and $3 change. And if you'll recall, you were willing to pay $5 for the energy drink. So basically you value the energy drink at $5. So you have a can of energy drink that is worth $5 to you, and you still have $3 in change. So the total value that you have is now $8, right? $5 of energy drink value and $3 change. So you somehow managed to turn a $5 bill into something that is a total value of $8. And basically that $3 change that you got is your surplus. That's the gain that you obtained, right? Since you were willing to pay $5 for it, but you only had to pay $2, the difference there is $3. That's $3 of value that you gained. Okay, so that's the concept of consumer surplus. Graphically, it looks like this. It's the difference between the demand curve and the price that consumers have to pay. Okay, so you can see here that Q1, that may be, the surplus for that person who buys that unit Q1. The surplus is given by the height there, right? The difference between P1, which is what they're willing to pay, and PA, which is what they actually pay in the market. And so they're gaining that difference there, and that's their individual surplus. If we add up each consumer's surplus, we get the area of this triangle or this wedge. So that whole triangle there is total consumer surplus. And again, it represents the benefits or the gains to consumers. Similarly, there's producer surplus. Now, this is the difference between what producers are willing to sell at and what they actually sell the item for in the market. So imagine that you are selling your labor and you would be willing to accept $10 an hour for your job, but you actually get $15 an hour for your job. Well, that difference of $5 would be your producer surplus as a laborer. So somewhat similar, but kind of the opposite side of the market. So graphically, it's this wedge here. So again, the supply curve represents what sellers are willing to sell at. What's their minimum selling price that they're willing to accept? And if they get anything higher than that, then it's a gain to them, and that's producer surplus. So for the seller that sells unit Q3, they'd be willing to sell at a price P3, that'd be their minimum selling price, but they're able to sell at PB in the market, and so the difference between PB and P3 is their surplus, producer surplus. And if we add up all of the producers' surpluses, then we get total producer surplus, and that's given by this red triangle here. Okay. And so basically what we're talking about are gains from trade. And the total gains from trade is just the sum or the addition of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So we add them together, and those two triangles added together represent total gains from trade. And so this is what it looks like graphically, right? The entire area of that triangle to the left of the equilibrium quantity, QE. All right, and so we'll wrap up this appendix thinking about how price controls can affect gains from trade. So what it ends up doing is reducing both consumer and producer surplus. And this happens regardless of whether it's a price ceiling or a price floor. Okay, so since there's no picture of that, let me show you one example. I'll show you a price ceiling and how that reduces gains from trade. Okay. Whoops. Okay. So here we got a demand curve and a supply curve. Here's our equilibrium. There's equilibrium quantity. There's equilibrium price. And if there were no price controls, this entire area here, let me actually connect these to the price axis. This entire area in here represents total gains from trade, right? This triangle up top here represents consumer surplus, and then this triangle down here below price represents producer surplus. Now, if we had a price ceiling, okay, a maximum price, a price ceiling, that would reduce the quantity supplied to this quantity here. So this is the quantity that would actually be sold in this market. And so what that means is that these units here are not traded. They're not sold. They're not traded. They're not bought and sold, which means nobody can gain from those units, right? There's no gain to be had from those units. And so, as it turns out, this does something interesting here. So since this is the price, now we're going to assume that there's no black market, but since this is the price, this area here would be consumer surplus, right? Because it's the difference between a person's willingness to buy and the price they have to pay, right? So here's this height here, it would be consumer surplus for one consumer at that unit. And if we add those up for every single consumer, then that's total consumer surplus. And then this triangle down here is producer surplus, right? Which is the difference between a seller's willingness to sell, their minimum price that they're willing to sell at, and the price that they actually get. So that height there would be one producer's surplus. And if we add them all up for all producers, that would be total producer surplus. And like I said, so there's two interesting things here, right? This right here would be producer surplus without a price control. So producers lose, let me use a different color. Producers lose this area here, right? Producers lose this, and then they also lose this area here, and it's transferred to consumers, right? So consumers benefit because they get to buy at a lower price, and producers lose out because they have to sell at a lower price. Okay, so there's that. And then on top of that, consumers here lose this consumer surplus as well. And it's because these units aren't being traded, right? So these units, the surplus from these units just disappears. And that's this box here, this orange triangle. This is what's called deadweight loss. Deadweight loss. It's just a loss of surplus. It's a loss of gains from trade. So this is another illustration of how price controls are actually not always very good. In fact, there's usually more negative effects from price controls than there are positive effects. So there you go. That's what a price control looks like graphically. Let me switch over here, just in case you couldn't see that. Okay, so there you go. If you need to pause the video and take a look at that for a second and make sure you understand all the aspects of it, go ahead and do that. But in any case, this concludes the video for Appendix B. I'll see you in the next module.